Now, your planned holiday hike up Mt Fuji may cost you a little extra these days. Japanese authorities are introducing a visitor's fee and a cap on the number of climbers at the iconic site. And Japan isn't the only country to start reining in tourists to popular sites.
Overtourism is something that plagues many of the world's most idyllic destinations, with social media and the quest for the perfect travel selfie compounding the issue. Joseph Cheer is a professor of sustainable tourism and heritage at Western Sydney University. He told us what's driving these restrictions.
We have an expectation about places we go to. We want them to be, to some degree, all to ourselves. We want an unimpeded view of the Eiffel Tower. But that never happens anymore because we're at a point, if we look at more and more globally, we're more affluent than we've ever been, and people can travel more than they've ever been. In Australia, it used to be we went up the highway for the school holidays, but now people jump on a plane and go to Bali or Fiji or somewhere like that. So it is a complex problem, and it will continue to be as people travel more. And we all want to go to the popular destinations. You know, we want to be in Paris with the finger saying, you know, we're lifting up, or leaning on the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
That's right.
So yeah, it's complex. And I think when it comes to over-tourism or too much tourism, the impacts are often felt most drastically by the host community, where things like inflationary pressures on rents and housing in places like Barcelona and Venice, or where our everyday, you know, going to the car park or the supermarket becomes so problematic because of the crowds that are there. And the emphasis here is that very often when tourism grows, it's a question of who's benefiting from this growth and who's bearing the cost.
Yes.
You know, in cities like Amsterdam and Venice, most of the short-term lets are owned by people who live in other cities. So they don't hear the rumble of the suitcases on the cobblestones in the morning. They don't see strangers coming in and out of the lift, right? So, yeah.
It's very difficult to find that balance, isn't it? But several governments, you know, we just heard from Japan there.
Yep.
I know Bhutan imposes a $200 visa every day that you're there in order to attract maybe the more elite, the more discernible tourists as well. Does that mean that there's a possibility that we're creating a class system here when it comes to tourism?
Most definitely. I think you see many countries now saying as a way of combating over-tourism, we'll make it more expensive. So what happens then is that it becomes indeed a class issue where only those who can afford to pay end up going. And most destinations are now saying, we want quality tourists, you know, the ones who stay longer and spend more money. But we know that the travelling public is far broader than that. What do we do with backpackers? What do we do with group tourists? What do we do with cruise tourists? I mean, that's another issue altogether, right? So yeah, I think, you know, for example, I was in Bali 3 weeks ago doing some research. While tourism is maligned in many ways, and a lot of Balinese find it really tough, right? Because they're in a bind. They rely on tourism for their livelihoods and incomes. But on the other hand, the impacts of too many tourists and the behaviour of tourists in particular. I mean, I was in Bali recently, and people walked into the supermarket in their bikinis, right? And you think, you wouldn't do that back in Sydney. Why do you think it's a good thing to do in Bali? So a lot of it is down to these behavioural issues and cross-cultural encounters that clash. Because what we find is that in countries where the visitor and their culture and language is much closer to the host, there's less of that clash. But when, let's say, we have, you know, tourists from a very different cultural background, different volumes of speaking, different ways of eating, different ways of interacting in space, that's when it becomes a bit problematic.
So these moves from governments, are they working, and is it enough to kind of protect these very precious environments?
Right, it's often something that's done in retrospect. You know, like in Fuji, as you mentioned, you know, they only know that things aren't going wrong when there's degradation in the tourist experience, or there's discernible issues in the environment. You know, it's like Mount Everest, right? It was one of those places that you think over-tourism is not necessarily something that would take place. You know, many argue that over-tourism is a media, you know, a moral panic. But it's not. For many host communities, as I said before, in the everyday, when your life is disrupted so much, it becomes a problem. And, you know, in Amsterdam and Venice, they had this phrase, you know, your visit, my nightmare. A good place to visit is a good place to live. And I think, you know, you've mentioned industry and government. But I think also the tourist bears an amount of responsibility. How we travel, how we behave, what we do when we're there, how we respect local customs and norms is really key to that, right? because it's that clash between two different cultures.